Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really pivotal, honestly incredibly tense moment in American history. We're talking about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This was a piece of legislation that created a massive crisis of conscience and law for the entire country. We're going to explore exactly how a single law can just inflame public opinion, push a nation right to the brink of division, and completely test the moral fabric of everyday citizens.
Our source material today actually frames this whole historical conflict using a really powerful quote from Psalm 82, verse 3. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. This ancient scripture kind of sets our moral compass for this explainer, because we're looking at a law that forced everyday, ordinary people to make some truly agonizing choices between strict legality and their deeply held moral beliefs.
So, here is our roadmap. We'll start with the Fugitive Slave Act itself, then move into a climate of fear, the legal obligation, northern resistance, a moral conflict, and finally, education and biblical morality. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The Fugitive Slave Act, the what of the 1850 law.
To really grasp the gravity of this, we need to understand exactly what this legislation demanded. Basically, this law mandated that runaway enslaved people had to be returned to their owners even, and this is absolutely crucial, even if they had successfully made it to free states. Plus, it actively punished anyone who helped them escape. So overnight, this made slavery a national issue. It effectively erased the safety of free states entirely. Getting to the North was literally no longer a guarantee of freedom.
And you can imagine the extreme polarization that followed. You had the northern view, which was just absolute moral outrage. For abolitionists, this was a direct attack on human dignity and their core beliefs. But then you had the southern view. They saw the law as a necessary federal protection of what they considered their property rights. So one side saw protecting people as a moral duty, while the other viewed the law as a necessary federal guarantee.
That brings us to Section 2, a climate of fear, the human cost.
Consider the staggering imbalance of power in the justice system of the 1850s. If someone was accused of being a runaway, they were legally silenced. They couldn't even testify on their own behalf. No way to defend themselves. Meanwhile, the commissioner deciding their fate was literally paid more money by law to rule that the person was an enslaved runaway rather than a free citizen. It was a completely rigged system.
Because of those stacked odds, false accusations just ran rampant. I mean, imagine living in a border state or a northern city back then. Families lived in constant waking anxiety. Someone who had been free their entire life, maybe their family had been free for generations, could just be seized on the street, taken to a sham hearing, and forcibly sent into slavery. Generations of freedom just stolen in an instant.
This fear was so deeply felt and so pervasive that simply staying in the northern United States was too dangerous. To actually escape the reach of this devastating law, a lot of free African Americans had to uproot their whole lives, moving much farther north or just abandoning the U.S. entirely to seek refuge in Canada. This wasn't just some political debate in Washington. This was a massive crisis of safety and human dignity.
Let's move to Section 3, the legal obligation, ordinary citizens implicated.
Here is how the law pulled everyday people directly into the enforcement of slavery. The act made it a federal crime not to help capture runaway enslaved people. So this didn't just apply to government officials or federal marshals. It legally obligated every single citizen, regardless of their personal beliefs, to participate in capturing human beings. And if you refused, well, the punishment was incredibly severe. You could face jail time or a fine of up to this massive sum, $1,000. To put that into perspective, in the 1800s, $1,000 was an absolute fortune. It was a life-ruining amount of money. So the government was essentially forcing everyday Northerners to sustain the institution of slavery against their own will.
Which leads us right into Section 4, Northern Resistance, defying the law.
Faced with this heavy-handed threat, Northerners didn't just quietly disagree. They fought back. Abolitionists formed and supported the Underground Railroad network. Northern states actually passed personal liberty laws to try and protect runaways. People organized massive public protests, and in some truly wild, remarkable instances, crowds actively and physically freed captured runaways directly from the hands of federal marshals. This resistance was personal, it was highly organized, and it was incredibly risky.
Section 5. A moral conflict. Conscience over compliance.
So why did this specific act harden attitudes so much? Well, forcing ordinary citizens by law to do something they believed was deeply sinful caused massive moral outrage.
Imagine being forced by the government, under threat of ruinous fines, to do something you believe is fundamentally unjust. It was a complete violation of conscience, and ironically, it ended up hugely strengthening the abolitionist movement.
The source material poses a really fascinating question here for us to chew on. How did the Fugitive Slave Act change the role of Northern citizens? Think about it. It took everyday people who might have just been bystanders and legally turned them into bound enforcers of an institution they despised.
And consider this too. Name one way Northerners resisted, and consider how the law affected free African Americans. When you look at the devastating daily terror inflicted on free African Americans and contrast that with the bold, dangerous ways abolitionists chose to rebel, you really see how conscience drove people to risk everything.
Finally, Section 6, Education and Biblical Morality, the HeroesMart philosophy.
Looking back at this historical crisis, our source text, the HeroesMart Academy Godly Learners series, arrives at a pretty profound overarching lesson. They argue that education must be intertwined with biblical morality, because education without morality will ultimately hurt people. The lawmakers who wrote the 1850 Act were highly educated, smart people, right? But their legal maneuvers lacked a moral compass regarding human dignity, which just led to profound suffering.
To address this, the curriculum actually points to Romans 8, 6 through 7, which promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their mind spiritual. The text uses this to contrast the intense anxiety and turmoil of the 1850s, teaching that true, genuine peace of mind comes from making sure your actions align with defending the weak and oppressed.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought from the source material. What is the point of being smart and supposedly educated if we continue to make choices that hurt others? Keep that question in mind as you reflect on the intersection of law, history, and your own moral compass. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.